Hey YouTube, today we're going to be taking a look at the brand Squier and asking the question, are Squier guitars only good for Squires? What I mean by that is an obvious play on the name Squire, even though it's spelled differently than the word Squire. I have an automatic association in my mind, and it took me a long time to really take a serious consideration of this brand, just because in my mind I hear Squire, I think medieval guy following a knight around. Could turn out to be a red shirt on his knight's cause, right? An apprentice, a learner, someone who's still picking up the craft, not someone who has arrived, right? And so what we're going to look at today is the brand Squier. After I got over my hesitation, I started collecting these instruments because, as I have discovered, I can put a little bit of time and work into finishing and doing some this and that and this and that to them, and you end up with really quite fantastic instruments. They're not as refined, they don't have the finer materials and so forth, but they are easily upgradable, and you can easily, through various maintenance and service and just working with them, you can really upgrade them into an instrument that's worth way more than they go for. So today we're going to take a look at the brand Squier, we're going to look at the history, we're going to look at a little bit of background, and take a look at some of the various offerings that they have as a brand. So the biggest impedance for me to pick one of these guitars up was just the name, Squier. It's kind of stupid, but there's a lot of power in the name, and I came to learn over time the history of the Squier company, and that it actually predates Fender by a good 50 years, more than 50 years, and it's, an old brand, but it's as its perception, right? The first thing that you got to get past is it just sounds like you say beginner, right? Squier immediately to me conjures beginner, learner, student. There's a similarity here with the PRS. You have a PRS SE. This is a good example right here. It's the Santana SE. Great guitar, fantastic guitar, but the SE stands for Student Edition, basically saying in a more subtle way, student guitar, right? So what's the deal with Squier? Where did the name come from? It actually started back in the 19th century. 1890 is when the company was founded, and it was initially a violin company. And it was founded in Battle Creek, Michigan. You can look at, there's some great articles out there. I'm not going to go too much into the history, but the reality is that it predated Fender by a pretty solid half century. And so by the time that Fender comes about, Squier had primarily gone into string manufacture, and they entered into a long-term arrangement with Fender, supplying them with strings, and so the early Fenders were strung with Squier strings. Now eventually in the 60s you have Fender actually buying the company and turning it into its dedicated guitar string brand, so it just becomes Fender Strings. So there is this gap there. From 65, the acquisition of Fender, they basically erase the name, they phase out the Squier logo and so forth, they just become Fender Strings. But then in the 70s you have, in the CBS area, there's the whole explosion of the import market of guitars. All these guitars start flooding in from Japan, eventually from Korea, and so forth. And so the American manufacturers, to keep up with that lower entry-level market, started testing out manufacturing overseas. And so this evolved into Squier being refounded as a dedicated guitar brand in 1982. And so at that point, Squier became Squier Guitars. It was rebranded. It was in essence, a new brand, but it was an offshoot, spin-off from Fender, right? So it's, strictly speaking, Squier predates Fender, right? But it's not like with Epiphone, where Epiphone predates Gibson, but they continuously made guitars. The brand underwent various changes and so forth, but they never stopped making guitars. Squier was not a guitar brand. It was a violin brand, then it was a string brand, so it only became a dedicated guitar brand again in 1982. So that's a little bit of the background on, where did these come from. Now initially they started making them in Japan. They also eventually started doing Korean, Indonesian, Chinese, variously. So that's a little bit about the brand. Now, what does Squier offer in terms of their products and models? Generally speaking, they are all going to be Fender guitars in terms of designs that have been just moved to overseas import manufacturing, and some of the various materials and stuff won't be as high end, but generally speaking, you're just talking about a less expensive Fender. That's why they've changed variously over the years how much the Fender brand stands out. Squier real big by Fender or backed by Fender. There's various ways that they've connected themselves to Fender and how big the F is compared to the S and so forth. But basically you're just talking about imported Fender products that are lower price range targeted. Now the range itself, as I mentioned, is primarily targeting the under $500. So generally speaking, these guitars are going to range from $200 to $500 new. Now there is a brand new, I believe it's an Amazon exclusive debut, where they've just started out with a Stratocaster and a P-Bass. I've got one on order and I'm going to do a video once it arrives. I'm very interested to see, because now they're trying to break into the like sub-economy market, the under $200 market, the bargain basement stuff. And I mean, I've watched some reviews of it, and for $120 brand new out of the box, I mean, you're getting a Fender backed product, right? And that is, generally speaking, because I've got other off-brands. I got Firefly, I've got Donner, Michael Kelly and stuff, and there's some really great off-brands as well that, as I grow the channel, I'm going to incorporate reviews of these like off-brands, right? These different brands and so forth. But generally speaking, I find that quality control for same level, cost level products, quality control in the Squiers tends to be better than the off-brands. Just tends to, okay? I'm not saying every Squier is great. I'm not saying every off-brand is junk. I'm just saying, as a general rule, one of the reasons that I steer students towards Squier is that you can get a lot of guitar for under $500, and generally speaking, it's going to be playable out of the box. You can make it better, but you don't have to do a lot of work to it to make it playable. So I've been talking a lot about all the good stuff about Squiers, that they are, very reasonably priced instruments, great Fender designs, just, not as refined, not as nice as a Fender in various ways, but still playable, good instruments. Now let's talk about common problems. Okay, these are common problems that you're going to find with these guitars. The first, and this is not for all of the finishes, but the hard shell polyurethane finish has a tendency to have basically catastrophic damage. You see there like a pretty massive chunk, and this was just shipping damage. A massive chunk came out of this, and I've already smoothed it down and begun. You see the crack even goes all the way up into there. So the finishes are not going to be as durable. That primarily has to do with both the quality, the grade of the paint that they're using, which they're cutting corners on, and the application process, which is very fast. Get it on thick, get a real thick coating on it, blast it, cook it, buff it, get it on down the line. It's a factory approach. And, you can't expect much else considering the price point of these. I mean, you just can't. Okay, so a lot of this is like, we need to temper our expectations of what we're getting out of these instruments. So that's a common thing, is you're going to see damage tends to be worse on these, depending again on the finish. Like this would not apply to that 40th edition Jazzmaster. Now, the number one functional issue for me that I've come into on a number of these guitars is the input jack. Is just, if anybody at Squiers out there listening, anybody out there, anybody at Squier listening, probably not, but if you guys are, put 50 more cents in and get a little bit better input jack. These input jacks, if anything is going to fail on these, it tends to be that. And the problem is that if your input jack goes out, you can start getting some really gnarly crackling, popping, hissing sounds. It can just cut out on you randomly, as it's wiggled and jiggled and so forth. So that's the weakest link, in my opinion, is the input jack, which just needs to be a little bit tougher. What I found is that just the little arm that comes out where the jack comes in and it's pressing up against that needs to be just tougher. It needs to be better. It needs to be better. It's not a hard thing to replace, and it's not an expensive fix, so it's something that can be done. But it's not just, you don't want to pick up your first instrument and it go in and out, in and out. So that's my biggest complaint about the Squiers, are their input jacks. Just otherwise, most of my concerns with particularly the lower price ones are just universal to the price category, and that is that the frets could be finished a little better, you know, just minor imperfections. The setup tends to come out of the box very high, but generally speaking, it doesn't take a huge amount of work to get one of these out of the box, get it playable. So, you know, just some minor this, minor that. If you're looking at buying one and you really just are like, I have no idea anything about guitars, I would say you know, you're better off to go up to like a Classic Vibes, which is going to have a better setup out of the box, or get a used one where somebody has already set it up. If you look through Reverb and stuff, there's plenty of stores out there that advertise this has been set up in our shop. Right, so a good setup out of the box, something like that, or find somebody local, a friend that plays guitar, or go to a music shop that has a luthier there, and it's going to add to the cost, but a really good setup on the guitar is going to make it more playable. It's going to dial it in more to your preferences, and it'll make it less frustrating to learn on.